Well, thank you everyone for coming out tonight. Thanks to Mark and Andrea for running a sweet little bookstore here in Livingston. I'm a huge fan. And thank you, Kevin, for extending the invitation to have me come and speak on behalf of Park County Environmental Council and the work that we're doing and the issues that we're facing here locally. My name is Max Hjortsberg. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the co-managing director of Park County Environmental Council. I've been with them for about 8 years now. I grew up here, grew up in the valley. I've lived here most of my life, deeply connected to this area. And I've been really enjoying the work that I'm doing with PCEC to continue to advocate for this place. So it's, I suppose I should say a little bit about PCEC for those you don't know. We are we've been in Park County for over 30 years now. We are very much a place-based local environmental advocacy organization working to protect this wild place, the wildlife, and the wild people here in Park County. But we don't do this work alone. I'm honored to be able to come up here and speak on our behalf, but I want to point out that there are other people and other groups working on grizzly bear advocacy in this area as well. Evan Stout, who runs Bearware Gardner, neighbors down south on the edge of the park. They've got grizzly bears wandering through their streets all throughout the year, getting into trash, eating apples, all of that. And Evan does amazing work to try to secure attractants and reduce the conflicts with bears in that community. Really worth checking out what he does. Bear Creek Council down in Gardner also does a lot of really great grizzly bear advocacy work. We work with Greater Yellowstone Coalition, our big brother over in Bozeman. They've been helping out with, doing a lot of work to help us try to secure the Park County green boxes. There's gates now at many of those locations. We're trying to try to make them even more bear-proof. A few years ago, there was an incident with a couple of young grizzly bears that got into those green boxes and got into some animal feed and whatnot around. They were chased around immigrant area until they managed to take off. And then also Save the Yellowstone Grizzly. Big shout out to them. We've worked with them for, since the last delisting effort. And they've done a lot of great advocacy work. If you haven't seen the films that they've put out, working with Doug Peacock, it's well worth seeking those out. And I just also want to point out, I think, I love how Elk River just has done such a fantastic job of blending the literary arts and conservation. They bring so many important authors and people who are working in the conservation world into Livingston to give readings like we're here for tonight. And often, PCs will try to help out in promoting that or being a part of it. Because, there's a real deep history of literature and the environment blending together. I think about Thomas Moran's paintings of Yellowstone that hung in the Capitol that helped create this new concept called the National Park. And in all the literature, from Walden to Silent Spring, Braiding Sweetgrass, and actually a local favorite, Grizzly Years. Those are just to name a few. And PCC has actually collaborated in the past with Elk River to fight for local conservation. We published a book together called Unearthing Paradise. Remember that, Mark? Yeah,
I do.
That book was put together. Myself, Mark, and Sebring Davis edited that book, and we reached out to local authors and people in the area to contribute to it. And that book was put together to fight, be a part of the Yellowstone Gateway Mine campaign, which at the time, from about 2015 on to about 2020, we were fighting two proposed large-scale industrial-sized gold mines, one in Immigrant Gulch behind Chico and the other on Crevice Mountain, literally on the border of Yellowstone National Park. And the efforts of that book was just to help raise awareness. People wrote wonderful essays, poems, and stories and came together. It's still available. I think you can buy one tonight too, along with a book for a high schooler. It'd be a great gift. It's still very relevant. Anyway, ultimately, the campaign that we led was to have a federal mineral withdrawal of all the minerals on the public lands in those 2 mining districts. And in the end, we ended up protecting over 30,000 acres of national forest land in Immigrant Gulch and on the border of Yellowstone National Park. I mean, and aside from the very obvious environmental impacts that a gold mine would cause with acid mine drainage and all the pollution and the inherent disruption and destruction of the landscape, those 2 areas of public land were also very critical grizzly bear habitat. The wildlife moving out of the north end of Yellowstone Park passes right through Crevice Mountain, Deckard Flats. It runs right up, if you know the geography, right up Bear Creek, great name, very pertinent. And then you drop into 6 Mile into Immigrant Creek. So that whole area is just very, very important wildlife habitat. And we ended up, we fought that campaign and we ended up protecting it. It was, a great local win all the way around. And I think, on that note, land development is still a huge threat, as we all know. We fought off gravel pits and tire dumps. Seuss Creek, as many of you may already know, is the most recent egregious example of a massive development that will just disrupt not only the fabric of this community, but the more and more ground we lose, the open space, the working lands, and the habitat, the less room there is for grizzly bears and other wildlife. They need that habitat. They need that room to spread out, to roam, and key to I think the bear's survival and our survival is keeping this landscape in a balance and maintaining its integrity, making sure that we don't just splinter it up and fragment it. The Yellowstone population of grizzly bears is still somewhat isolated from the other populations, and I think we really need to think not only of how we protect the landscape in our own backyard, but also how we get those populations holistically together. So that's a big key, and we're facing a serious challenge in the next year. Grizzly bears will be delisted one way or the other. If it's the Fish and Wildlife Service or if it's a congressional delisting, it's coming our way, and so we have our work cut out for us, and it's going to take all of us paying attention, working together, raising our voices, advocating for the any and all continued protection of grizzly bears. As I was thinking about it, I was like, I don't want to necessarily start the whole thing off on such a down note, but it's just the reality. And I came across this quote from Rebecca Solnit, and she said recently, "The fact that we cannot save everything does not mean we cannot save anything, and everything we can save is worth saving." And I think grizzly bears are definitely top of that list. So, to maybe change it up a bit before I turn it over to Kevin here, since I was extolling the virtues of literature and conservation work. As I was thinking about speaking this evening, I remember that I'd written a poem. I write poetry in my spare time, and which I haven't had much of lately. But I wrote this 15 years ago. It was a grizzly bear poem, and I thought I'd read it tonight. It's still relevant. It's called "Wilderness Neighbors." You could smell the cheap perfume a mile away, 2 teenage girls walking on the levee, Indian summer sun. A red truck passes, radio on, a voice yelling, "This is America, for crying out loud." And you remember a time when it wasn't. Most crying is done quietly. The boy in the truck throttles the motor loudly, grabbing the girl's attention. They shot a grizzly that killed a calf, only after the bulls in the herd circled the young animal, keeping the bear from returning to the kill. A standoff, it was called in the local papers, a high noon in the wild kingdom. Hunger becomes habituation, and habits are never good, yours included. So you think firing squads are not a thing of the past. True story. Thank you, everyone. just a bit down the stage. Okay, thank you, Max. Thank you, PCEC. The website is maxpcec.org.
PCECMT.org.
PCECMT.org. Go there, donate, find out what their projects are and how you can get involved and support. And if you weren't at the chili dinner last night, you missed the best part of the PCEC year. And who won the best chili 2 years in a row?
Well, just this year.
Oh, you didn't win last year? Oh, I voted for him 2 years in a row. His chili was great. Max Hjortsberg, poet, environmentalist, chili maker. Okay, so it is really great to have Kevin back. As I said earlier, just give you a tiny bit about him before I let him take over. And he is a backcountry firefighter and paramedic, or he has been. Who knows what he's doing these days. He's the author of the award-winning Wild Rescues, a paramedic's extreme adventures in Yosemite, Yellowstone, and Grand Teton, Lights and Sirens, the education of a paramedic, and Beneath Blossom Rain, discovering Bhutan on the toughest trek in the world. He's written for national parks, Backpacker, Utney Reader, Yoga Journal, and the Orange County Register. He's worked as a park ranger and paramedic at Yellowstone, Yosemite, and Grand Teton, and it is wonderful, finally, after all these years, to actually have him in person. So, Kevin Grange, everyone.
Thank you for being here tonight. And so I put together a fun presentation for you with video and photos, because grizzly bears, they're these charismatic apex predators. So I don't think it would do them justice to just sit here and read from my book. So they deserve more. And so we have a great presentation for you. And thank you to Elk River for inviting me. I kind of view independent bookstores as the beating heart of the book industry. And so it's a beautiful space. I'm honored to be here, so thank you so much.
It's a slow stream.
Yeah. So I'd like to thank Grizzly Bears for bringing us together. And it's great to see a room full of bear people. But here's the thing. When I started this journey that I'm going to tell you about tonight, I didn't know if I was a bear person. And I'm going to give you a few reasons why. Number one, that ferocious bear of myth and movie. Another reason, Timothy Treadwell, the Grizzly Man, and Amy Huguenard, fatally mauled in Katmai National Park in 2003. Now, if some of you get a little squeamish at the sight of blood, you might want to avert your eyes, as we hear from Todd Orr, who was attacked by the same bear twice just outside of Ennis, Montana.
Yeah, life sucks in bear country. Just had a grizzly with 2 cubs come at me from about 80 yards, and I sprayed the shit out of her with bear spray, and then I went on my face and protected the back of my neck. She got my head good. I don't know what's under my hat. My ear.
And there was also the fatal mauling of Lance Crosby when I worked as a park ranger and paramedic at Yellowstone, and also Mark Upton when I worked in Grand Teton National Park. And then there was famed Bear 399, taking her 4 cubs on a walkabout through downtown Jackson Hole, where I live. And this is security footage outside the police station. And my fire station just is about a block away, where I work as a firefighter paramedic. So has anyone here been to Jackson Hole? So can you imagine stumbling out of the cowboy bar, having been overserved and encountering 5 grizzly bears? So another reason I wasn't sure if I was a bear person, when I hear all those voices of dissent, when we think about reintroducing grizzly bears into places like Washington State's North Cascades. But what if that's not the whole story on grizzly bears? What if most of the time when we hear about them and read about them in the news, it's when they do something bad? What if there is a whole secret life of grizzly bears that we don't know about? So, if we go back to the bear I opened with, that ferocious bear of myth and movie, well, I'd like to show you another side of that bear and introduce you to Bart the bear and his trainer, Doug Seuss. So I spent the day with Doug and Lynn at their ranch in Heber, Utah, and they train bears for Hollywood films. Their bears have acted alongside of Alec Baldwin, Robert Redford, Morgan Freeman. And when I asked Doug what drew him to grizzlies, he told me, I was drawn to their immense capacity for deep, profound thought. Viscerally and emotionally, bears are these big, powerful animals with cognitive thought. They're calculating, as smart as an ape, and as diverse in personality as any individual with mood swings. There's a power there. It brings up your senses. Grizzlies awaken your sense of awe. And when I asked Doug if there was anything that bears had taught him in particular, he said, "What haven't they taught me?" before growing more thoughtful. They taught me the importance of our planet, this beautiful hanging ball. I learned that being with wild spirits increases the fever you have for the planet. So tonight I'm going to take you on this journey that mirrors my own, from not being sure if I was a bear person and being conflicted about having them on the landscape, to being an advocate of respect for these animals and their place in the ecosystem. So a little bit about me. Before that, there's a quote from the English artist S. Devlin, who says, "When we learn the name of a species, we conserve a place for it in our imagination." So grizzly bears and brown bears are the same species, Ursus arctos. So a lot of folks don't know that. Historically, grizzly bear referred to bears in interior North America, and brown bears referred to bears that had access to the marine environments. But since they're genetically similar, I kind of use the terms interchangeably throughout the book and tonight's presentation. So a little bit about me. I was born in Chicago, grew up in New Hampshire, and my parents, who are here tonight, had me camping when I was 6 weeks old in a portable crib. And as you can see, bears have been a constant love of mine, beginning with the teddy bear. And family camping trips were always my happiest memories. And it was there, during a family camping trip in New Hampshire, that I had my first experience of a bear in the wild. So we had gone out for a hike after dinner, sort of a nighttime walk, and as we were going, I began to feel the presence of a bear. And if you spend any time in the outdoors, you've had a similar experience where you can sense the animal before you see it. It's kind of like an animal ESP. And so we were walking, and I saw a strand of bushes, and I just knew there was a bear in there. So what did I do? I did the first thing you should never do, was I approached the bear. And as I did, I heard a low growl that clearly said, "Don't come any closer." So what did my family do? We took off running, doing the second thing you should never do. And as we ran, we mimicked prey. Luckily, none of us were hurt. And as for our black lab, how did he compare to other loyal dogs like Old Yeller? Well, he took off ahead of us. He left us high and dry. It was as if he knew the old adage, you don't have to run faster than the bear, you just have to run faster than the people you're with. So over the ensuing years, I had more bear encounters in New Hampshire, and many times it was on these camping trips where we would go to the town dump and watch the black bears feed on the garbage. That was before we realized that a fed bear is a dead bear. So black bears were cool, but when I saw Thomas Mangelson's photo of a bear at Brooks Falls in Katmai National Park, I fell in love with grizzlies. So it made sense that once I was hired by the Park Service, I chose a park, Yellowstone, that had grizzlies. And it was there that I encountered my first grizzly bear in the wild. I walked out to Morning Glory Hot Spring, and I saw a grizzly bear 100 yards away. So frantic, I grabbed my radio and I called 911 dispatch. "Dispatch, we got a grizzly bear." "Okay, How far away is it? It's about 100 yards. Is anyone approaching the bear? I took a look. Not really. Is the bear approaching people? No. What transpired was a sigh, and the 911 dispatcher said, "You mean to tell me you called 911 dispatch to tell us there's a grizzly bear in Yellowstone National Park?" I was mortified, and making matters worse, my radio transmission was broadcast all across the world. So I look at Grizzly Confidential as a love letter to Bear 399. Is everyone familiar with Bear 399?
Yes.
Well, she's raised 18 cubs across 8 litters by the roadsides of Grand Teton National Park. So maybe she was displaced to this marginal habitat by more dominant bears, or maybe she's just so clever she's realized that using the human shield protects her cubs from those adult males that might predate upon them. So as we saw in the earlier video, she went on a walkabout in 2001. And she started appearing on all the trails where I mountain biked, trail ran, in Jackson Hole, even on the Snake River where my wife and I would take out on rafting trips. And it felt a little personal and predatory. And so I realized, along with being fascinated with grizzly bears, I was also terrified by them. So, is Grizzly 399 an anomaly? And the answer is no. So, grizzly bear conservation is a modern success story. And what's happening is they're pushing out beyond the boundaries of national parks. So they're appearing in the plains of Montana, in the Bighorn Mountains of Wyoming. So that's kind of the new normal, that the forefront of grizzly bear conservation is in places like Bozeman and Livingston and Big Sky, Missoula, Jackson Hole. So I was terrified. And as a firefighter paramedic, I've been trained that I need to kind of go into those places that scare me, that the best way out is through. So I embarked on this journey to learn everything I could about grizzly bears, see if I could understand them, and answer the important question, how can we coexist? Which is how I found my wife and I on Kodiak Island. So we landed there, hopped on a seaplane, and we flew over to the northwest side of Kodiak. And then we hopped on the Buchanan River. So just after that video ended, we ran aground because the tide was going out. So our guide took the boat and walked upriver, kind of leaving us on our own, walking beside the river. And he also took the bear spray and the bear gun. So we're walking hand in hand, and suddenly 2 cubs spilled out from the sedge, 5 yards to our right. The cubs were adorable with honey-colored fur, fluffy ears, and white natal rings around their neck. But Megan and I had more pressing thoughts. Where's Mom? A large sow suddenly reared up in the tall grass behind us, dropping a fish from her mighty jaws and fixing her eyes on us. It was a surprise encounter with a sow with cubs at close range on a food source. If one was to devise a most likely to get mauled scenario, this would be it. Not good, I whispered to Megan. My sympathetic nervous drive immediately kicked into overdrive. You're going to die. Run, screamed one part of my brain, while the other part told me to stay cool and calm. Respect the bear, and the bear will respect you, the elders of Kodiak have preached for millennia. Like a lot of indigenous wisdom, the mantra seemed so simple and linear when I first heard it. But the more I thought about it, the more complex, cyclical, and way beyond my comprehension it became. Torn between fight or flight that morning, Megan and I chose a third option. We froze. To our relief, the bear didn't attack. To be honest, I hadn't really expected her to. My journey into the secret life of brown bears had already taught me that everything I thought I knew about them was wrong. So for instance, I thought they were only these ferocious carnivores, but I came to learn they're more opportunistic omnivores that eat a wide variety of food and are mainly vegetarian. I thought they were true hibernators like the Arctic ground squirrel, whose temp drops to about 27 degrees. But grizzlies, their temperature only drops about around 12 degrees, from 100 to 88, and their hibernation is kind of like a state of torpor. So it's a series of sleep-wake cycles, and they can arouse almost instantly if they sense a threat. I also learned they have superpowers. Bears can see smells, and they can smell time. So if you think about scent, it denatures at a given rate. So a bear can come across a trail that an animal, passed by, and they can know if that animal went right or left, but they can also know, based on the denaturing, how long ago the animal was there. So they can smell time. Despite their size and strength and superpowers, brown bears are still surprisingly vulnerable. They too have kryptonite, humans, fellow predators, bipeds, and omnivores who compete for the same land and resources and hold the fate of grizzlies' survival in their hands. Regardless of not knowing that a sow with cubs won't always attack, I was still terrified during that close encounter. I carried bear spray, but had committed the cardinal mistake. It wasn't accessible and ready to deploy within 3 seconds. "Let's back up slowly," Megan whispered. Standing tall and sniffing the coastal winds, the sow glanced around before dropping back down on all fours and picking up the fish. The two of us walked on. As we did, I felt a trigger surge of elation. By all accounts, our bear encounter had been a resounding success. We hadn't stressed the family unit or changed our behavior. And most importantly, we hadn't been charged. I've been watching wildlife for 40 years, and that experience beats all the others, I exclaimed. So that was a pivotal moment for me on my journey. And I look at this book as sort of a journey to deprogram my mind from the myth of the killer bear, and that was the first crack. And this idea of respect the bear and the bear will respect you, that's a theme that changes in meaning throughout my journey. So each chapter is kind of a lens to learn about grizzly bears, and one of the first stops was the Human Bear Conflict Conference in Lake Tahoe. And I learned about the evolution of human-bear conflict from bears are the problem, so we relocate or kill them, to humans are often the problem, so we educate them. I learned about a bear's world, that they have 6 months to eat a year's worth of food, and they're always kind of weighing the caloric return from their energy expended. So if they can expend less calories and get access to unsecured food or trash, that's what they're going to do. I also learned about the challenges that ranchers face. And if we want grizzlies on the landscape, we need to support the ranchers as a community. So the rancher can't alone, endure the cost of the electric wire. We need to have like a carcass reimbursement program or a carcass pickup program if a cow dies, so it's not just wasting away on the landscape and attracting bears. I also learned that the best practices of staying safe in bear country really work. So over my travels in Alaska and Wyoming and Montana and Idaho, had a lot of close encounters with bears, surprise encounters, but they all ended well because we were doing those best practices of traveling as a group, making noise, carrying bear spray. I took a bear safety class taught at Four Corners by Chris Forrest, who's a former Navy SEAL. He teaches for his company Tactic. And he preaches this idea of redundancy. So 2 is 1 and 1 is none. So you should always carry 2 means of protection. Maybe it's a can of bear spray and an air horn, or maybe it's 2 cans of bear spray, or bear spray and a handgun. Whatever works, but just have that redundancy. So Lynn Seuss, Doug's wife, she told me that many folks think the bear is our first deity. So in southeast France, at the Chauvet Cave, a human hand ritualistically placed the skull on the edge of this rock over 32,000 years ago. And cave bear art is, throughout these caves. We also learned that Native Americans both feared and revered bears, and many of their creation myths involved bears, such as Devil's Tower. So the story here was this bear was chasing these girls, and the Great Spirit raised up the tower to save them, and then the cracks are the bear's claws. So in Kodiak with the Alutiiq, they believe humans can transform into bears, bears can transform into humans. And then in Japan, on Hokkaido, the Ainu, So these Native American communities, they hunted bears, and if they did, they used all parts of the bear. And in some of the circumpolar areas like Sweden and Russia, they would leave the skull on a tree facing east as a matter of respect. And today in Alaska, brown bear is the one game animal where you don't have to harvest the meat. And instead of leaving that skull, on the tree facing east, you have to bring the skull into Alaska Department of Fish and Game. So it's just vastly different from the way it was. So as I said, the Native Americans coexisted with grizzly bears until around 1805 when Lewis and Clark arrived. And they went out of their way to shoot at every grizzly bear they saw, and in doing so created aggressive bears. And we talked about Thomas Moran earlier. His majestic paintings of the Grand Canyon of Yellowstone, or Thomas Ayer's paintings of Yosemite Valley, that really sold America on conservation in national parks. There was no social media and newspaper at the time. So with grizzly bears, a lot of those early paintings were negative, and that sort of built this narrative that we had. And then this was the era of manifest destiny, where it's God's right, or God's plan for us to migrate west and to subdue Native Americans and to kill apex predators like wolves and bears. And so the grizzly range historically went from the Arctic into the plains down into Mexico. So that really shows you their ecological flexibility. But now it's just sort of those brown spots. So in the lower 48, they exist on these ecosystem islands. And so the goal and the challenge is to connect those ecosystems, connect the greater Yellowstone ecosystem with the northern continental divide, so the glacier and Yellowstone bears, just to get that genetic diversity. California once had 10,000 grizzly bears. They thought so well of them, they put them on the flag, and then they killed every last one by 1924. So I spent a day with Carrie Gunther, the bear biologist at Yellowstone, and I learned all about the relationship between climate change and human-bear conflict. So the white bark pine trees are getting killed and destroyed by the mountain pine beetle, which historically wouldn't survive through the winter. But with warming temperatures, the pine beetle is surviving, killing the trees whose seeds and nuts are a main food source for grizzly bears. And so how that relates to conflict, this is me sort of directing traffic at a bear jam in Grand Teton. If there's natural food sources, they're going to stay up in those higher elevations. But if there's not, they're going to be down in the towns, possibly creating conflict, creating bear jams, and that sort of thing. Once upon a time, they fed bears at Yellowstone and Glacier. It was a nightly event. Rangers would feed the bears, there was stands set up. And that went on until about 1967, when there was the Night of the Grizzlies, and 2 women were killed in separate incidents. And that caused the Park Service to re-examine their relationship with creating these human-habituated, food-conditioned bears. Another thing I learned was about John and Frank Craighead, who pioneered radio collar of tracking of grizzlies and other animals. And they really preach this idea of we need to manage the species that has a huge range, not on an agency level, but on an ecosystem level. So the Park Service has to work with the Forest Service, who has to work with communities like Livingston. And the data, being a paramedic, we place a lot of emphasis on evidence-based research, and as we see over, 180, from 1872 to 2018, over 183 million visits, only 8 fatal bear attacks, so 0.04% per 1 million visits. So again, that narrative that we hear is not always true. So my journey took me to Katmai National Park, and that's about 250 miles south of Anchorage on the Alaskan Peninsula. And you might know it from the bear cams and Fat Bear Week, in which you vote on the fattest bear. And so it's sort of celebrating the intact ecosystem, and just also educates folks on the challenges that bears need to survive. So all visits to Katmai begin with mandatory bear school. And this is Kelsey, who was teaching our bear school that afternoon. I could barely contain my excitement. I was about to witness one of the greatest wildlife spectacles on earth, and maybe glimpse some of the bears I'd fallen in love with on the bear cam. Otis, Chunk, Grazer, and Holly. Honey, Megan said, gesturing down to my hand on her knee. You're cutting off the circulation. Sorry, I replied, releasing my enthusiastic grip. Just excited. At Brooks, visitors coexisted alongside the great gathering of Bruins due to several highly enforced rules. All food and trash had to be left in a highly secure food cache. Food could only be eaten in Brooks Lodge or in one of the picnic areas framed with bear-deterring electric wire. Before we were dismissed, Kelsey told us the viewing platform etiquette. No smoking, no flash photography, and most importantly, no loud noises or cheering. What type of idiot would cheer? I asked Megan, rhetorically, as Kelsey dismissed our group. That's it, I asked, standing. We can just go and wander around now? I felt as if I'd just been given the keys to Jurassic Park. It was a cool, overcast autumn day, and the trees lining the river were a sorbet swirl of orange, maroon, and yellow. During our 1.2-mile hike down a dirt road to the viewing platform, our guide Jennifer Culbertson told us how grizzly bears were ecosystem engineers. So they till the soil with their long, excavator-like claws. They disperse seeds through their scat, and they scatter salmon carcasses, which brings carbon and nitrogen into the ecosystem. I also learned all about their hierarchy. And so they're sort of positioned on the river based on where they fall in that dominance, that dance of dominance. So the most dominant bears will get the best fishing spots. Once we reached the viewing platform, Brooks Falls came into view. Sure enough, there was a behemoth brown bear on the lip of the falls, staring intently down at the water, waiting to catch a fish. Do you know who it is? Megan asked. The large bear had a light brown coat with dark patches around her eyes. I think it's Grazer, bear 128. Suddenly, Grazer, standing at the lip of the falls, caught a leaping fish. Yes, I exclaimed, loudly clapping. Megan was more than embarrassed. You're that guy, she said, the cheerer. I was ashamed to have broken viewing platform etiquette, but it was suspenseful watching these bears, and knowing the stakes and the effort that they put in, it did kind of make you want to cheer. After spending an hour on the platform, we wandered back to the main viewing. After spending an hour on the platform, we wandered over and sat in the tall grass beside Brooks Lake. A few bears snorkeled and dove around for fish in the distance, and one blonde subadult looked like he was just floating on his back, enjoying a moment of rest and warm sunshine on his face. Following a picnic lunch, eaten safely behind an electric fence, we returned to the main viewing platform to discover the falls empty. No bears stood on the lip or fished in the jacuzzi below. Gazing out at Brooks Falls without bears, the area had lost its magic. I contemplated a future without bears and recalled something Lynn Seuss had said to me. Without wildlife, it's just scenery. So when we talk about North Cascades introduction, the plan is 3 to 7 bears every year for about 10 years. And they're hoping for subadults, and they're going to choose bears that have no conflict. But surprisingly, there's already bears in Washington State, and they like to run on the treadmill. So Washington State University has a bear center with 11 grizzlies on campus, and they're doing some fascinating research, especially for me as a paramedic, that bears gain all this weight, and yet they don't get heart disease. They can turn their insulin sensitivity on and off like a light switch, and they don't get diabetes. They don't eat, drink, or defecate, yet they don't get kidney failure. And they can lower their heart rate to 8 to 10 times per minute, yet their blood doesn't clot, and they don't get strokes. So there's the idea in the science at Washington State University. They believe brown bear physiology might help solve these human afflictions. They've also taught their grizzlies to do voluntary blood draws with the help of some honey water. So they spray the honey water, and then the bear will eventually slide its paw through the fence, and they can do voluntary blood draw to check that blood sugar and some proteins that they think might hold the answer. So I talked about the bear's intelligence, and Jane Goodall, the first use of tools were the chimpanzees, and Jane Goodall observed the chimps using a stick that they'd lower into an ant hole, and then hundreds of ants would climb up it, and then they would eat the ants. And so here, they're doing something similar. So the bears are faced with a problem. In this case, it's an elevated donut that they can't reach. And then they have a bunch of solutions, which are the tree trunks. And the bear has to make that connection to solve the problem. And as we watch this video, I want you to kind of just see the bear calculating about where to put the stool and which stool to check. And you can really see that intelligence. So one of the fun things I saw at the Washington State Bear Center up in Alaska is those charismatic, goofy personalities that emerge when the bears aren't food stressed. And we don't often see it here in the lower 48 because many times they're displaced by tourists or they're too busy trying to forage for food. But they just have these large, charismatic personalities. And this is Zuri at the Bear Center. And there's a bunch of people observing over here, and she likes to flick a little bone at them to sort of taunt them. And that just kind of shows some of their personality.
Is it stuck on her claw? She flings off, she flicks it. She like flicks a little bone piece. It's so cute. That's hilarious. Yeah.
Another chapter, I spent the day with Nils Peterson, who runs the Wind River Karelian Bear Dog Program, and they're using these Karelian Bear dogs with embedding with wildland firefighter teams because they're in the middle of bear country, unsecured food and garbage, and they're also using them on ranches. And when I asked Nils, sometimes the bears will do the dogs will do a hard release and chase the bears back into the woods. He said the Karelian Bear Dog Program is not about, unleashing dogs to go chase things. It's really ultimately about educating people. So I learned about some of the challenges that grizzlies face. Black bears are often poached for their bile, especially in Southeast Asia, whereas grizzlies are often the victims of vandal killings, where people just don't like grizzlies, so they have this idea of shoot, shovel, and shut up, or the only good bear is a dead bear. And so Island Park has had a few of these, serial killings or multiple killings. And then they're really starting to look at some of these claims of defense of life and property. Are some people just shooting these bears, flouting the ESA Act, and just saying, hey, my life was in danger? I also learned about the challenges that bears face. And so roads are like walls to bears. And as I mentioned, we really want to connect the ecosystems to get that genetic diversity. But if you think of that image of the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem, I'd like to show you it now and just show you all the roads that surround it. So it's really hard for those bears to make that passage. And sadly, as we learned recently with 399, getting struck and killed by a vehicle. So over the course of my journey, I came to recognize that coexistence is possible and it's worthwhile, and that bears have tremendous value. They have the ecosystem engineering value of tilling the soil, spreading the seeds. They have that cultural value that many Native American communities it's the grizzly bear that connects them to their past. They have that existence value. So just that sense of awe that we have looking out at the landscape and knowing there's grizzly bears there. There's also that economic value. Bears like $3.99 bring in millions of tourist dollars. Ultimately, my travels took me to McNeil River State Game Sanctuary in southeast Alaska, about 250 miles south of Anchorage. I'd always been taught that when facing a bear, I should stand tall, make myself appear big, and wave my arms. But now, as two young grizzlies approached our group on the sedge, biologist Beth Rosenberg told us to huddle together, stay silent, and kneel. This female trusts us because we're acting in a predictable manner, whispered Rosenberg. The yearlings continued forward a few paces, then stopped 10 feet from us. Rising to stand, they took a long sniff before dropping back down to all fours, racing back to mom, and play wrestling in the grass. We were communicating with those bears with very subtle, nuanced body language in a way that they understood, explained Rosenberg. We were using the language that they would use with another animal. Amazing, I replied, grabbing my backpack and joining her. Isn't it fun just to be another animal on the landscape and not be number one? Rosenberg said with a wide smile. So McNeil is an amazing place where it protects the highest concentration of brown bears on the planet. And only 10 people are allowed to visit every 4 days. And you're chosen by a lottery system. And they've observed over 74 bears feeding in the river at one time, and over 140 bears in the area one summer. So I confronted my biggest fear by camping in McNeil alone without the safety of a bear wire. And the first couple nights I didn't sleep at all, but I came to see that a bear's behavior is very plastic. And these bears have never been fed garbage, they've never been collared for research, and there's clear boundaries between the human space and the wild space. And so they've been taught to not come into camp, and we don't even use electric wires. So in this case, we did have to stand there, but I also just would observe the bears, just respecting the boundaries of camp. And Larry O'Miller was the former manager there for over 30 years, and he instituted this policy where we always traveled as a group of 10. We hiked the same trails at exactly the same time each day, and we observed the bears from the same two spots. And so the bears began to expect this predictability from us, and then in turn they acted predictable, which was very different than the grizzly man. So he was by himself. He routinely approached bears. We secured our food. He had food in his tent. So just a whole different way of working with the bears. And by doing the McNeil way of viewing, you just can have some amazing bear encounters. So that was the two cubs I read about. And then here, just to kind of show you what is possible, and these are well-fed coastal brown bears, so they're definitely different temperament than some of our food-stressed bears we have in the lower 48. But just to show you what's possible if we kind of stick to these standards, we're going to see a sow just walk right past us just a couple feet away, and she's going to turn her back and lay down as her cub comes after her. So she trusts us so much to do that. So it's really quite amazing. And this is sort of a couple cell phone videos that I spliced together. And now we'll see her cub come down the line. So not really the ferocious killer myth that I'd been taught. So some folks ask how you can tell a huge adult male grizzly, and it's often with this wide cowboy swagger that they have, because their legs are so big, they have to sort of swing them as they walk. So this is a bear called Chops, who was the most dominant bear at McNeil that summer. And that's a photo I took, and I did have a close encounter with Chops, where I really learned, am I going to stand my ground or not? And you can read about it in the book. But as you can tell, since I'm here, it did end well. So the question is, how do we bring McNeil back home? McNeil, only 10 people visit every 4 days. And so I asked Beth Rosenberg that, how do you manage these bears? And she said, we don't manage the bears at all. We manage the people. And so she said, that's what we can bring back home. Manage the people. So ultimately, at the end of my journey, I decided I was a bear person. But it didn't just mean I believed in securing attractants like food and garbage and compost. It also meant that I believed in intact ecosystems, connected habitats, clean water, abundant salmon runs, and supporting all the flora and fauna that fall underneath this fascinating apex predator. And when I think of the magnificent creature who set me on this journey, I think of one bear who helped me reconnect with the wildness in me. I think of one devoted mother who filled me with joyous awe at the beauty and mystery of our planet. I think of the matriarch of the Tetons. I think of Bear 399. So this is a memorial that people erected under the Antler Arch in Jackson Hole, and dozens of kids wrote letters to 399, letters of thanks. And with that, we'll go to questions. Thank you so much. All right, so any questions about the journey or bears or writing a book? Anything of interest?
I have a question.
Yes.
I haven't followed since 399 was killed, but was her cub ever located?
Not to my knowledge.
Yeah.
And so,
I haven't seen that either.
Yeah. I guess the one good thing that came out of that is now there's a discussion of just wildlife crossings and overpasses and underpasses and just really trying to connect those ecosystems.
Right.
Yeah, we kind of think of 399 as that gateway bear. So she's a gateway for many folks into the bear world and the challenges that they face and that type of thing. Yes, in the back.
Can you say more about the genetic situation in the Yellowstone and the Upper Continental Divide there, and like how dire is it, and how important is it to connect those two places for the bears?
The bears are doing well, and they're, thriving in these different ecosystems. And I think it's the gold standard that they want to get that genetic diversity. And so I think possibly bears have already made the journey. It just hasn't been a collar bear. And so I sort of follow the lead of the biologists that I spoke with, like Dr. Chris Sardine, who was in Livingston a couple weeks ago. And, they place a lot of importance in connecting those ecosystems. Did you have a question? No, go ahead.
How have you managed to speak to anybody in Yellowstone to figure out how we're going to manage our tourists instead of managing the wildlife?
It's a challenge, as Carrie Gunther mentioned, but with what we've learned is there's so much sociology in human-bear conflict. It's the messaging, and I think that's why a lot of folks wanted to speak with me, because some people don't trust scientists anymore, or science, or the experts. So they wanted someone like me to help get the word out. And with human-bear conflict, they've learned that you have to make the right thing easy and simple and also affordable. So, you know, if you have that bear box right next to the campsite, it's easy, it's free, people will use it. So people want to do the right thing. It's just we got to put the systems in place for them to do it. And so like in Jackson, $3.99 got into trash, and now there's a movement to have bear-resistant trash cans. But there's a whole like financial piece that they're costly, and you know some folks can't afford them, and even the trash company needs different types of trucks. So it's a very nuanced conversation. But Yellowstone, they do have millions of tourists, and they've done a great job as far as reducing conflict, or you know, every trash can's bear resistant, and the rangers do nightly patrols to look for unsecured food. So it's really a success story, but the numbers are kind of getting out of control. And so they might institute a reservation system down the road to kind of combat some of that. And yes.
You mentioned getting ready for a new world with delisting and pending. So what are the steps or the actions that you're thinking about in anticipation of that?
I think we're not quite sure which way it's going to go, but again, I sort of defer to Chris Sardine, who I interviewed multiple times, and he led the recovery efforts, and he spent his whole career trying to get them delisted, and now he's very concerned about management at the state level, so he's opposed to delisting. So I think, you know, that to me sends a pretty strong signal that, you know, we need to maybe do some more work before we delist them. And I live in Jackson Hole, and we had that incident where that wolf was run over by a snowmobile, and its you know, muzzle was duct taped and dragged into a bar. And, you know, just seeing the state's reaction to that and how they kind of swayed on the side of supporting snowmobilers doing that kind of leads us all to have concerns about the delisting. So we'll see, and I guess we'll find out in, you know, January. But we're definitely concerned, and you know, there is a high mortality of bears, whether it's vehicle strikes or you know, defense of life and property killings, or you know, vandal killings where people just shoot grizzlies. So it's like a nuanced question. Anyone else? I'll be around afterwards. If you have a question, you can feel free to come up and ask me. And yeah, thanks again for coming out. And I had a wonderful time. And yeah, have a great night.